Who remembers this? It's like an anthem to my childhood. Lived in southern Minnesota. Spent a lot of time in South Dakota. Spent a lot of time watching this TV show. Understanding new terms. Albert came along, burned down the blind school, the whole 9 yards. This was my little house on the prairie experience. Is that probably the same with a lot of people my age too, Cold War kids, all that good stuff. So why am I playing that song? You ever just have one of those days where you're like, I think I need to maybe step back a little bit and just random things come at you. It's just a random day of the week, middle of the COVID-19 breakout. And I just decided today that instead of trying to be quirky and whatnot for the kids, I was going to actually just do a nice long read of one of my favorite sequences. One of my favorite authors is actually Laura Ingalls Wilder. And this is the book By the Shores of Silver Lake. And it's when they moved to Dakota Territory after they had lived in Walnut Grove. I have a little thing of South Dakota here. They actually, if you read all the books, which we did when the girls were a lot younger, I think they had actually lived in Iowa. I know they lived in Wisconsin, obviously, Walnut Grove, Minnesota, where the show was set. And then DeSmet has the Laura Ingalls Wilder Festival, DeSmet, South Dakota. But it wasn't South Dakota, I don't believe. I think it was Dakota Territory when they moved there. So, but then they spent a little bit of time in Kansas, funny enough. I don't know if anybody remembers that. And like I said, I think a little bit in Northeast Iowa as well. But anyway, the reason why I want to read this is because I want to do a little bit of reading, and I don't want it to be a kid's book necessarily. And this might be a good one where if the little one needs to, Tara Ophelie or Lily, if any of you or any other kids that are out there just need to kind of listen to somebody drone on about something, I will give you that right now. But what I want to highlight is what I like about this book so much. What was profound to me was that Laura Ingalls Wilder took the time to spend a day with her dad, and they went out. This is kind of the only picture I believe that's really in the chapter. They went out and rode out together beyond the railhead that was in town, and went out past the grade and watched the guys building the railroad. And she essentially details the same process that would have happened in where Selby, Java, and other parts of the Midwest and throughout North America and the world later on, where people were watching the manual process, which has today been replaced by, obviously machinery. We're not building a lot of railroads these days, not in this country, but back then it was a very manual process. But if you see all these towns and all these places around, particularly the upper Midwest, where I grew up, and you'll see towns along these lines, these tangents, and there'll be nothing there. It'll just be a mound of grass. Well, that's an old railroad bed. And I find it absolutely fascinating. It's the way my brain works. It's what I grew up with as a kid. I wasn't great at reading, but I was better with maps and geography and stuff like that. And I guess that's kind of the reason why I work in the field that I do today with GPS and all that. But I have a love in my heart for whatever reason. I've been trying to figure it out for parts of railroading and niches. One of the niches that I love is looking at old abandoned railroad grades and following towns along places that it's kind of like ghost railroads. If you think about it, used to carry trains and all sorts of things, commerce around the country. And they were important things that were parts of a lot of people's lives. And I think this day and age, with what we're going through with quarantine, I think it's time to kind of reassess. And every now and then a day comes along where you want to just read. So this is actually, it's 10 o'clock at night in Colorado right now, and it is on Wednesday, April 29th. And this chapter it starts at chapter 10 of By the Shores of Silver Lake, and it's called The Wonderful Afternoon. And she talks about going out and watching them build the railroad. So that's what I'm going to read, because I absolutely love this chapter. I like most of the Laura Ingalls Wilder books actually a lot better than I I ended up liking the show later, but the show was so iconic that, of course, it's all just intertwined. And then having moved to Minnesota, you get a little bit of dose of that because it's Laura Ingalls and all this. So, but I really did later appreciate reading the books to the girls, and this was my favorite chapter out of any of them that she's ever written, was this one specifically. So I'm not going to bore you with reading the entire series, but I am going to read you this chapter. So if I'm going to just go on, there's not a ton of pictures. If there are, I will hold it up and you'll see it, but most of this is just going to be me sitting here with my friend Board. Introduce yourself, Board. Sorry, cover your eyes. There he is. Remember him? Yeah. So Board, I named a Board, but kind of like that. As you figured out by now, I'm a little weird anyway. So got my pipe. Got something else here at the end. It's just like any other good railroad building story. You always have a golden spike nearby, and we're coming in to May, which is a big month. Completion of the first transcontinental railroad. Won't bore you with all that, but I am going to read now By the Shores of Silver Lake, chapter 10, A Wonderful Afternoon, 91 to 108. So that's what you're in for. It's about 18 pages of fun. So here we go. Again, just to refresh, there's the picture of them out front with the scrapers and then building the grade and moving the dirt. So here we go. Early every morning while Laura washed the breakfast dishes, she could look through the open door and see the men leaving the boarding shanty and going to the thatched stable for their horses. Then there was a rattling of harnesses and a confusion of talking and shouts, and the men and teams went out on the job, leaving quietness behind them. All the days went by, one like another. On Mondays, Laura helped Ma do the washing and bring in the clean-scented clothes that dried quickly in the wind and sunshine. On Tuesday, she sprinkled them and helped Ma iron them. On Wednesdays, she did her task of mending and sewing, though she did not like to. Mary was learning to sew without seeing. Mary had gone blind. Her sensitive fingers could hem nicely, and she could sew quilt patches if the colors were matched for her. At noon, the camp was noisy again, and all the teams and men coming in to dinner. Then Pa came from the store, and they all ate in the little shanty, and the wind blowing against it, and the wide prairie outside the door, softly colored in all shades from dark brown to russet and tan. The prairie rolled in gentle swells to the far edge of the sky. The winds were blowing colder at night. More and more wild birds were flying southward, and Pa said that winter would not be long in coming. But Laura did not think about winter. She wanted to know where the men were working and how they made a railroad grade. Every morning they went out, and at noon and at night they came back. But all that she saw of working was a smudge of dust that came up from the tawny prairie in the west. She wanted to see men building the railroad. Aunt Docia moved into the camp one day, and she brought 2 cows. She said, I brought our milk on the hoof, Charles. It's the only way to get any out here where there aren't any farmers. I'm sure that's how she sounded, but I'm going to make up her voice. One of the cows was for Pa. She was a pretty bright red cow named Ellen. Pa untied her from the back of Aunt Docia's wagon and handed the halter rope to Laura. Here, Laura, he said, you're old enough to take care of her. Take her out where the grass is good and be sure to drive down the picket pin good and firm. Laura and Lena picketed the cows not far apart in good grass. Every morning and every evening they met to take care of the cows. They led them to drink from the lake and moved the picket pins to fresh grass, and then they did the milking, and while they milked they sang. Lena knew many new songs, and Laura learned them quickly. Together, while the milk streamed into the bright tin pails, they sang, a life on the ocean wave, a home on the rolling deep. The pollywogs wag their tails and the tears roll down their cheeks. Sometimes Lena sang softly, and so did Laura. Oh, I wouldn't marry a farmer. He's always in the dirt. I'd rather marry a railroad man who wears a striped shirt, right? But Laura liked the waltz song best. She loved the broom song, though they had to sing broom so many times to make the tune swing. Buy a broom, buy a broom, broom, buy a broom, broom, buy a broom, broom. Will you buy of this wandering Bavarian a broom to brush off the insects that come to annoy you? You'll find it quite useful by day and by night. I'm sure they sang it just like that, but I don't know what the melody was. It's getting hot in here. So I made it up, and you can too, if you ever read this book. The cows stood quiet, chewing their cuds, as though they were listening to the singing until the milking was done. Then, with the pail of warm, sweet-smelling milk, Laura and Lena walked back toward the shanties. In the mornings, the men were coming out of the bunkhouse, washing in the basins on the bench by the door and combing their hair, and the sun was rising over Silver Lake. In the evenings, the sky flamed with red and purple and gold, and the sun had set. The teams and the men were coming in, dark along the dusty road they had worn on the prairie, and singing. Then quickly, Lena hurried to Aunt Docia's shanty, and Laura to Ma's, because they must strain the milk before cream began to rise and help get supper. Lena had so much work to do, helping Aunt Docia and cousin Louisa, that she had no time to play, and Laura, though she did not work so hard, was busy enough, so they hardly ever met except at milking time. If Pa hadn't put our black ponies to work on the grade, Lena said one evening, you know what I'd do. No, what? Asked Laura. Well, if I could get away, and if we had the ponies to ride, we'd go see the men working, said Lena. Don't you want to? Yes, I want to, Laura said. She did not have to decide whether or not she would disobey Pa, because they couldn't do it anyway. Suddenly one day at dinner, Pa set down his teacup, wiped his mustache, and said, you ask too many questions, Flutterbudget. But put on your bonnet and come up to the store along about 2:00. I'll take you out and let you see for yourself. Oh, Pa! Laura cried out. There, Laura, don't get so excited, Ma said quietly. Laura knew she should not shout. She kept her voice low. Pa, can Lena go too? We will decide about her later, said Ma. After Pa had gone back to the store, Ma talked seriously to Laura. She said that she wanted her girls to know how to behave, to speak nicely in low voices, and have gentle manners, and always be ladies. Right, Lily? They had always lived in wild, rough places, except for a little while on Plum Creek, a.k.a. Walnut Grove. And now they were in a rough railroad camp, and it would be some time before this country was civilized. Until then, Ma thought it best that they keep themselves to themselves. She wanted Laura to stay away from the camp and not get acquainted with any of the rough men there. It would be all right for her to go quietly with Pa to see the work this once, but she must be well behaved and ladylike, and remember that a lady never did anything that could attract attention. Yes, Ma, Laura said. And Laura, I do not want you to take Lena, said Ma. Lena is a good, capable girl, but she is boisterous, and Docia has not curbed her as much as she might. If you must go where those rough men are working in the dirt, then go quietly with your Pa and come back quietly and say no more about it. Of course, I lost my place. Sorry. Yes, Ma, Laura said. But what, Laura? Ma asked. Nothing, said Laura. I don't know why you want to go anyway, Mary wondered. It's much nicer here in the shanty or taking a little walk by the lake. I just want to. I want to see them building a railroad, Laura said. She tied on her sunbonnet when she set out and resolved to keep it tied on. Pa was alone in the store. He put on his broad-brimmed hat and padlocked the door, and they went out on the prairie together. At that time of day, when there were no shadows and the prairie looked level, but it was not. In a few minutes, its swells hid the shanties, and on the grassy land there was nothing to be seen but the dusty track of the road and the railroad grade beside it. Against the sky ahead rose up the smudge of dust blowing away on the wind. Pa held onto his hat, and Laura bent her head in the flapping sunbonnet, and they trudged along together for some time. Then Pa stopped and said, "There you are, Half Pint." They were standing on a little rise before the land. Before them, the railroad grade ended bluntly. In front of it, men with teams and plows were plowing onward toward the west, breaking a wide strip of prairie sod. "Do they do it with plows?" Laura said. It seemed strange to her to think that men with plows went ahead into this country that had never been plowed to build a railroad. "And scrapers," said Pa. "Now watch, Laura." Between the plowing and the blunt end of the grade, teams and men were going slowly around in a circle over the end of the grade and back to cross the plowed strip. The teams were pulling wide, deep shovels. These were the scrapers. Instead of one long shovel handle, each scraper had two short handles, and a half hoop of steel curved from one side of the scraper to the other side. The team was hitched to this curve of steel. When a man and his team came to the plowed land, another man took hold of the scraper handles and held them just high enough to thrust a round shovel point into the loose earth of the plowed ground while the team went on and earth filled the scraper. Then he let go of the handles. The full scraper sat level on the ground, and the horses pulled it on around the circle, up the side of the grade. On the grade's blunt end, the men who drove the team caught hold of the scraper's handle and tipped the whole scraper over in a somersault inside the curving steel that the horses were hitched to. All of the dirt was left right there, while the team drew the empty scraper down the grade and on around the circle to the plowed land again. There, the other men caught hold of the handles and held them just high enough to thrust the round shovel point into the loose earth until the scraper was filled again. And on around the circle it came sliding behind the team up the steep slope of the grade and somersaulting over again. Team after team came around a circle. Scraper after scraper tipped over. The teams never stopped coming. The scrapers never stopped filling and tipping. As the loose soil was scraped from the plowed land, the curve widened out so that the scrapers passed over freshly plowed ground ahead while the plowed teams came back and plowed again the ground that had been scraped. "It all goes like clockwork," said Pa. "See, no one stands still. No one hurries. When one scraper's filled, another one is on the spot to take its place, and the scraper holder is there to grab the handles and fill it. The scrapers never have to wait for the plows, and the plows go just so far ahead before they come back to plow again the ground that had been scraped. They are doing great work. Fred is a good boss." Fred stood on the dump watching the teams and scrapers circling and the plows coming around inside the circle and moving out ahead of it again. He watched the dumping of the scrapers and the dirt rolling down, and with a nod or a word, he told each driver when to dump his scraper so that the grade would be even and straight and level. For every 6 teams, one man did nothing but stand and watch. If a team slowed, he spoke to the driver and he drove faster. If a team went too fast, he spoke to that driver and the driver held his horses back. The teams must be spaced evenly while they kept on going steadily around in a circle over the plowed land and to the grade, over it and back to the plowed land again. 30 teams and 30 scrapers and all of 4 horse teams and the plows and all the drivers and the scraper holders all were going around and around, all in their places and all moving in time there on the open prairie, just like the works of a clock, as Pa had said. And on the prow of the new railroad grade in the dust, Fred the boss kept it all going. Laura would never have tired of watching that, but farther west there was more to see. Pa said, "Come along, Half Pint, and see how they make a cut and a fill. Laura walked with Pa along the wagon track where the crushed dead grasses were like broken hay in the dust where wagon wheels had passed. Farther to the west, beyond a little rise of the prairie, more men were building another piece of the railroad grade. In a little dip beyond the rise, they were making a fill, and farther on, they were making a cut through higher ground. You see, Laura, Pa said, where the ground is low, they make the grade higher, and where the ground is high, they cut through and make the grade level. A railroad roadbed has to be level as it can for the trains to run on. Why, Pa? Laura asked. Why can't the trains just run over the prairie swells? There were no real hills, and it seemed a waste of hard work to cut through all the little rises and fill and all the little hollows just to make the roadbed level. No, it saves work later on, Pa said. You ought to be able to see that, Laura, without being told. Laura could see that a level road would save work for horses, but a locomotive was an iron horse that never got tired. Yes, it burns coal, said Pa. Coal has to be mined, and that's work. An engine burns less coal running on a level than it does going up and down grades. So you see, it takes more work and costs more money now to make a level grade, but later on there'll be a saving in work and money so that they'll be used for building something else. What, Pa? What else? Laura asked. More railroads, said Pa. I wouldn't wonder if you'll live to see a time, Laura, when pretty nearly everybody will ride on railroads and there'll be hardly a covered wagon left. Laura could not imagine a country with so many railroads, nor one so rich that nearly everybody could ride on trains, but she did not really try to imagine it because now they had come to the high ground where they could see the men working at the cut and the fill. Right across the prairie swells where the trains would run, the teams with plows and the teams with scrapers were cutting a wide ditch. Back and forth went the big teams pulling the plows, and round went the teams hauling the scrapers, all steadily moving in time with each other. But here the scrapers did not go in a circle. They went in a long, narrow loop into the cut and out again at one end, and at the other end they went over the dump. The dump was a deep ditch at the end of the cut, and crossways to it. Heavy timber shored up the sides of this ditch and made a flat platform over the top of it, like we saw in the picture. There was a hole in the middle of this platform, and earth had been graded high on each side of the ditch to make a road level with the platform. Out of the cut came the teams steadily walking one behind another, pulling the loaded scrapers. They went up the grade to the top of the dump, and they went across the platform. Each passed over the hole, one horse walking on each side of it, while into the hole the driver dumped a scraper load of dirt. Going steadily on down the steep grade and around, they went back into the cut to fill the scrapers again. All the time, a circle of wagons was moving through the dump under the hole in the platform. Every time a scraper dumped its load, a wagon was under the hole to catch the dirt. Each wagon waited till 5 scraper loads had poured down into it, and then it moved on, and the wagon behind it moved under the hole and waited. The circle of wagons came out of the dump and curved back to climb up over the end of the high railroad grade that was coming toward the cut. Every wagon, as it passed over the grade, dumped its dirt and made the grade that much longer. The wagons had no wagon boxes. They were only platforms of heavy planks to dump the dirt. The teamster turned those planks over one at a time. Then he drove onward down over the end of the fill and back into the endless circle through the dump to be loaded again. Dust blew from the plows and the scrapers, and from the dump and the end of the hill. A great cloud of dust rose up all the time, up over the sweating men and the sweating horses. The men's faces and arms were black with sunburn and dust. Their blue and gray shirts were streaked with sweat and dust, and the horses' manes and tails and hair were full of dust, and their flanks were caked with muddy sweat. They all went on steadily and evenly, circling into the cut and out, while the plows went back and forth, and circling under the dump and back over the end of to the fill and under the dump again. The cut grew deeper, and the fill grew longer, and the men and the teams kept on weaving their circles together, never stopping. They never miss once, Laura marveled. Every time the scraper dumps, there's a wagon underneath it to catch the dirt. That's the boss's job, Pa said. He makes them keep time just like they were playing a tune. Watch the bosses and you'll see how it's done. It's pretty work. On the rise above the cut and on the end of the fill along the circles the bosses stood. They watched the men and the teams and kept them moving in time. Here they slowed one team a little, and then they hurried another. No one stopped and waited. No one was late at his place. Laura heard the boss call out from the top of the cup, "Boys, move along a little faster." You see, Pa, it's nearing quitting time, and they'd all slow down a little. They can't put that over on a good boss. The whole afternoon had gone while Pa and Laura watched those circles moving, making the railroad grade. It was time to go back to the store and the shanty. Laura took one last long look, and then she had to go. On the way, Pa showed her the figures painted on the little grade stakes that were driven into the ground in a straight line where the railroad grade would be. The surveyors had driven those stakes. The figures told the graders how to build the grade on low ground and how deep to make the cuts on high grounds. The surveyors had measured it all and figured the grade exactly before anyone else had come there. First, someone had thought of a railroad. Then the surveyors had come out to that empty country, and they had marked and measured a railroad that was not there at all. It was only a railroad that someone had thought of. Then the plowmen came to tear up the prairie grass, and the scraper men to dig up the dirt, and the teamsters with their wagons to haul it. And all of them said they were working on the railroad, but still the railroad wasn't there. Nothing was there yet but cuts through the prairie swells, pieces of the railroad grade that were really only narrow, short ridges of earth, all pointing westward across the enormously grassy land. When the grade's finished, Pa said, the shovel men will come along with the hand shovels, and they'll smooth the sides of the grade by hand and level it on top. And then they'll lay the rails, Laura said. Don't jump ahead so fast, fluttered Budget, he says. Pa laughed at her. The railroad ties have got to be shipped out here and laid before it's time for the rails. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither's a railroad nor anything else worth having. Boy, hallelujah to that, Charles. The sun was so low now that each prairie swell began to have its shadow lying eastward, and out of the large pale sky, the flocks of ducks and the long wedges of geese were sliding down to Silver Lake to rest for the night. The clean wind was blowing now with no dust in it, and Laura let her sunbonnet slip down her back so that she could feel the wind on her face and see the whole great prairie. There was no railroad there now, but someday the long steel tracks would lie level on the fills and through the cuts. The trains would come roaring, steaming, and smoking with speed. The tracks and the trains were not there now, but Laura could see them almost as if they were. Suddenly she asked, Pa, was that what made the very first railroad? What are you talking about? Pa asked. Are there railroads because people think of them first when they aren't there? Pa thought a minute. That's right, he said. Yes, that's what makes things happen. People think of them first. If enough people think of a thing and work hard enough at it, I guess it's pretty nearly bound to happen, wind and weather permitting. What's that house, Pa? Laura asked. What house? Pa asked. That house. That real house. Laura pointed. All this time she had been meaning to ask Pa about that house standing by itself on the north shore of the lake, and she had always forgotten. That's the surveyor's house, Pa said. Are they there now? Laura asked. They come and go, said Pa. They had almost reached the store, and he went on. Run along now, fluttered Budget. I've got work to do on the books. Now you know how a railroad grade is made, and be sure to tell Mary all about it. Oh, I will, Pa, Laura promised. I'll see it out loud for her, every bit. She did her best, but Mary only said, I really don't know, Laura. Why you'd rather watch those rough men working in the dirt than stay here in the nice clean shanty. I finished another quilt patch while you've been idling. Loser. But Laura was still seeing the movement of the men and the horses in such perfect time that she could almost sing the tune to which they moved. Thank you. And that's almost right at half an hour. And just like any good closing of a railroad tale, Golden Spike, folks. Appreciate your time. If you had a railroad in your town, that might have been how it was built, particularly if it was on the prairie. Hopefully I didn't bore you too much, but it's a very, very important part of my life. And I look east from where my heart and soul is, and milepost 784, Selby, South Dakota as a kid, and looked at my dad's hometown, Java, high on the east, 7 miles away. And it veers off the railroad, and there's an old right-of-way between the original grade that was built in 1900, and that's what prompted all the interest over all the years in abandoned railroads, was the abandoned railroad grade through my mom and dad's hometowns up in Walworth County, South Dakota. So next time you see an abandoned railroad grade, kind of think about it a little bit. But I hope you enjoyed this. All right. Everybody stay safe. Take care. Have a good one. Hope you enjoyed it. Night.